It's like people are still trickling in. Give it one more minute. There we go. It's a decent turnout, given that we changed the time. Hopefully more people can watch. Yes. I'm sad you'll miss, but you'll have another lunch at 6 weeks. Yeah. Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Arik Burakovsky, and I manage the Russia and Eurasia Program here at Fletcher. We're happy to have you join us for our annual open house, which gives us an opportunity to showcase the program to you, the Fletcher community, and the broader Tufts community, to get to know the new students. Welcome to those of you who are starting out as first-year students at Fletcher, and to introduce our wonderful team of student staff, visiting scholars, and faculty. So the Russia and Eurasia Program at Fletcher supports teaching and research on a wide range of historical and contemporary issues surrounding Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. We support courses on the region at Fletcher. We hold an active speaker series on campus with a variety of scholars and practitioners. We organize study trips to the region, most recently to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkey. We offer students funding for research and internships related to Russia, and they go to countries all across the region. We bring visiting scholars from the region to Fletcher, including from Russia, Ukraine, and most recently from Turkey, and soon from Armenia. And we support a variety of student initiatives, including the Fletcher Eurasia Club. I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleague, Professor Daniel Drezner, who teaches economic statecraft, US grand strategy, global political economy, and power in world politics at Fletcher. And he co-directs the Fletcher Russia and Eurasia Program alongside Professor Chris Miller, who's on sabbatical this semester, but will return to campus next semester to teach the histories of US and Russian foreign policy. We'll speak first very briefly about the program and have a round of introductions for our visiting scholars. Then we'll have a conversation with Professor Drezner about the dynamics of Western support for Ukraine. And we'll conclude with a presentation of the Fletcher Eurasia Club and our student staff. And you'll have plenty of time for questions about the program and the club. So Dan, let me turn it over to you for just a few words about the program.
I'm not sure I can say anything more than what you said, which is to say that it's worth noting that, you know, as recently as 6 or 7 years ago, this club didn't exist, this program didn't exist. The terrifying thing was that at the time I was considered the leading expert on Russia and Eurasia in this school because I'd actually lived in Donetsk back in the day when I was a civic education project lecturer. We're all in a much better place now. Well, not Ukraine, but the study of it is in a much better place. Beyond bringing Professor Chris Miller on board, we also have Professor Elizabeth Leek, who's an expert on Central Asia, and we've sponsored a number of partnerships and exchange programs. And we're excited about the sort of community that we've seen grow here over the last couple of years. And indeed, I've been very impressed with the Eurasia Club. And I would add that the most recent trip to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan was eye-opening for me, not just in terms of seeing the dynamics playing out in Central Asia, but watching the Fletcher students have to interact with other students and sort of, you know, taking the lead in terms of, you know, having conversations, establishing a dialogue, and even getting Russians to talk to them.
Great. So let's have a round of introductions for our visiting scholars. Do I see Pavel Luzin in the back?
Yes. Hi, Pavel Luzin, specialist in Russian military sector and all the stuff. So always welcome you.
So Pavel is very humble. He is our resident expert on Russia's military and defense industry. He's from Perm in Russia, and he's been with us for the past academic year. Ozgur, do I see? There you are.
Hello, my name is Özgür. I'm from Turkey. I study military power and technology and its relationship with regime type and conflicts, international and domestic conflicts in general. And happy to be here and share my research with you in the future.
Excellent. And I think we have Maxim Krupski remotely.
Yep. Thank you so much for having me. So I hope you hear me well. Yeah. Everything is okay or not?
Maxim, we're having some trouble hearing you. Let's see if we can get that fixed on the technical side.
Okay.
Just one moment.
Okay. Maybe that's better.
Excellent.
Okay, so yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm Maxim Krupski. I'm a human rights defender from Russia, visiting scholar at Fletcher, also a non-resident fellow at George Washington University, and from October this year, also a researcher at Wilson Center, Kennan Institute, Wilson Center, Washington, D.C. I'm working on research dedicated to foreign agents legislation in Russia and other countries, but of course, mostly in Russia. And I'm trying to analyze different mechanisms, repressive mechanisms in Russia against non-governmental organizations.
Great.
Yeah, civil society as a whole.
Thanks, Maxim. And is Vladimir Dubovik with us?
Yeah, I'm here. You don't see me?
No, Maxim. Let's see if we can get Volodymyr on the screen. There we go.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi. Hi, everyone. Good to be here today. Unfortunately, can't be with you in person, but I'm Volodymyr Dubovik, Associate Professor of International Relations from Odessa Meshnikov University in Ukraine. The last academic year, I was a visiting professor at Fletcher and Political Science Department of Tufts as well. I delivered 2 courses and took part in a number of projects and roundtables, and including the study visit with Arik to Moldova, and then with Arik and a number of students and colleagues to Turkey as well in the March of this year. I also, as of recent, am a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, SIPA, in Washington, D.C., and I'm looking forward to be working with my colleagues at the Russia and Eurasia Program and broader in the Fletcher and Tufts community in the coming in this starting, which just recently started school year. Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir, and we look forward to seeing you back on campus as soon as possible. And I should also say we have another visiting scholar who is originally from Russia, but he's been living in the United States for a number of years, Stanislav Stanskih, who focuses on Russia's constitution and human rights. And we'll be joined by one more visiting scholar from Armenia next month who focuses on cybersecurity policy.
And in addition,
Stas is here. Great.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah.
So go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I just want to that was a perfect introduction. I just want to say that also I'm preparing expert opinions on post-Soviet country conditions for immigration and asylum cases in the United States, and work closely with the Russian democratic diaspora. So any questions regarding human rights issues, persecution of activists in Russia, I am here to help.
Thank you, Stas.
Yeah.
Excellent. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine recently marked its 19th month. And since the war began, we've witnessed unprecedented Western unity in terms of imposing sanctions against Russia, solidarity within NATO, the recent expansion of the alliance to Sweden and Finland, as well as Western financial, military, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. From February 2022 through July of 2023, donor countries spent more than the equivalent of $254 billion on the war in total. That's according to the Ukraine Support Tracker from the Kiel Institute for World Economy in Germany, including around $74 billion from the United States and roughly $141 billion from the EU countries and institutions. These funds have been critical to Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia, to keep its government afloat, and to help more than 6 million Ukrainian refugees and over 5 million internally displaced persons. This conversation will cover and consider Ukraine's heavy reliance on Western military and economic assistance, what goals the West has in Ukraine, and how domestic politics in Western countries might impact future aid to Ukraine. So I will ask Professor Drezner several questions, and then we will invite all of you to ask questions. So my first question is, Western support has made it possible for Ukraine to avert, defeat, and liberate nearly half of its occupied territories, including during the latest counteroffensive. Ukrainian courage and resilience in the face of Russian meddling, aggression, and alleged war crimes is certainly commendable. But without Western weapons, intelligence, military training, and I should add the Starlink satellite internet, Ukraine might have already capitulated to Russia. Professor Monica Toft, who teaches strategic studies and currently serves as academic dean of Fletcher, has called the conflict a, quote, classic case of a proxy war. How would you describe the involvement of the United States and NATO in the war?
I don't know if I would disagree with Professor Toft. It is, it's not just a proxy war is the way I would put it. The thing to realize about, the Russian invasion of Ukraine isn't just that it obviously threatened European allies, and there's an argument that, do you want Ukrainians fighting Russians in Eastern Ukraine, or do you want to be fighting Russians on NATO soil? And so there's a reason why, there's a sort of strategic reason why you're seeing the support for Ukraine. But I think the other thing that's sort of unprecedented about what Russia did was they really did violate the sort of, post-1945 order of we are not going to annex territory by military force. There are a couple of exceptions that have happened over the history. Think about the Israeli annexation of Golan or what have you, but that's a slightly weirder situation. This is a case where Russia, which had recognized Ukraine's borders, just decided, no, we are going to move in and go beyond annexing the Crimea to now annexing, at least according to Russia's constitution, 4 additional territories. And this is sort of the moment that norm starts to degrade, you are unleashing chaos on the world because there are lots of countries that have irredentist claims elsewhere. And so this is a norm that you want to reinforce. And it's worth noting that beyond the sort of strategic dynamics of what's going on, norms are, the power of a norm is not just whether it's adhered to 100%. The power of a norm is if it's violated, what is the response? And you can argue that in this case, the response has been, in some ways unprecedented. This is also an unusual, I think, example of statecraft because when we think about how, states respond to crises, what is often, the story you often tell is that no one saw this coming. And this is a case where that wasn't true. The United States knew this was coming 6 months out. The United States managed to persuade most of the European, a lot of the European elites, this was going to be coming. And so I think this is one explanation for why the Western response has been relatively well coordinated, because in some ways they had the playbook of what Russia was planning on doing. And that, I think, allowed them to respond in a much more coordinated way than if, let's say, they had moved on a country that no one was expecting.
So you said that the West has responded in a relatively coordinated way, and yet there have been considerable frustrations on the part of Ukraine about military aid from the West arriving too slowly and about the lack of a roadmap for Ukraine to become a member of NATO. initially the West was rather cautious about not breaking any of Russia's red lines, and only gradually did donor countries start to send more advanced weapons to Ukraine, including the long-range missiles, tanks, the MiG-29 fighter jets, and now possibly the F-16 fighter jets. And some countries like Poland and the UK seem to be ahead of the United States on these issues. So which countries do you think are setting the agenda for Western support of Ukraine? Which Russian red lines, like the introduction of a no-fly zone or deploying Western troops to Ukraine, do you think the West is unwilling to break? And what's the likelihood that the war could escalate, either vertically to Russia's use of nuclear weapons or horizontally to Russia attacking another country like Moldova or to launching a war against NATO?
So I guess I would say there are two countries that are really setting the agenda in terms of support for Ukraine, and those countries are Ukraine and the United States. This is where I think Volodymyr Zelensky has been really, it's in some ways his best attribute in terms of leadership has been pushing the envelope constantly in terms of what he wants to support Ukraine's fight against Russia. And every time he talks about this, if I told you a year ago that we were going to be sending F-16 to Ukraine, I don't think anyone would believe me. It just didn't seem terribly plausible. And what's been interesting there has been this sort of slow motion, expansion of the weapons that are being sent to Ukraine. And I'm sure for Ukrainians, it's been exasperatingly, a slow motion exercise. But I do think there's been virtues in it. And one of the virtues has been that what we've seen is that most of Russia's red lines aren't in fact actually red lines. And this is important. I'm sure you all read the story about Elon Musk deciding to, not allow Starlink to be used in terms of the attack on Crimea. And part of the reason is that apparently the Russian ambassador to the United States convinced Elon Musk that if they did attack Sevastopol, if they did, engage in actions in Crimea, that would lead to the use of nuclear weapons. And the forward response I have to this is Elon Musk got played. And what I mean by this is that what we saw throughout the spring and the fall of 2022 was a lot of nuclear saber rattling by Putin and by some of the other, by Medvedev and some of the other sort of principal Russian spokespeople. And yet in the end, the United States and Europe escalated in terms of what weapons it sent to Ukraine, escalated in terms of where attacks would take place, including on the Kerch Bridge. And lo and behold, nuclear, and furthermore, pushed for an offensive in which, as you pointed out, Ukraine regained something like 50% of what Russia had taken since February 2022. And yet the Russians haven't, there's been no use of nuclear weapons. There's been no indication that that's going to happen. I think, the horizontal integration, so let me put it this way, I don't think either vertical or horizontal integration is going to happen. I don't think vertical integration is going to happen because I don't think Putin is going to use nuclear weapons. The only way I could conceive of that is if you actually had a Ukraine that didn't just retake, all the territory, but starts moving on Belgorod or, elsewhere. And by the way, this is another red line that got crossed where you're now seeing pretty regular attacks on Russian soil by Ukrainian forces, or by Russians that have been armed by Ukrainians. And again, there's been retaliation, but it hasn't gone nuclear. The other red line that I do think is serious is that if NATO were to actually get involved in terms of fighting. But this is where both Russia and NATO have a mutual interest in not letting that happen. There is no way NATO wants to have troops on the ground in Ukraine. That is the risks of that would be considerable. At the same time, the last thing Russia wants is to widen this war and actually involve NATO. And I think the best example of this was the moment when there were some missiles that fell in the corner of Poland next to Ukraine, where it turned out they were Ukrainian missiles, but in the sort of real-time moment, no one knew what was entirely going on. What was very interesting to me was that during that entire sequence of events, the Russians, the Americans, most of NATO, everyone, it got very clear very quickly, no one was going to escalate because everyone knew that was the last thing that anyone wanted. So I am less worried about vertical and horizontal escalation than I think a lot of commentators are, which does mean that it winds up just primarily being a fight of Ukraine armed and trained by the West against Russia.
But there are certain red lines that we have not yet hit, such as Ukrainian troops trying to retake Crimea. Is that potentially a red line that could lead to escalation?
It could be, but I think I guess the way I would put it is that that's a longer term conversation. I don't see that happening anytime soon, I guess is the way I would put it. There have been plenty of Ukrainian attacks on Crimea, in terms of missiles and drones and what have you. So it's not like that's unprecedented. And I'm not sure that the only way that I could see Ukraine moving on Crimea is if that would potentially be a sort of endgame strategy where, and Zelensky said this, I think, about a month into the war, where he actually floated an idea that I think eventually is going to have to come to pass, where he suggests that basically we can have a referendum on Crimea in about a decade and that'll decide its future. And it wouldn't, like a deal in which the Russians wind up with Crimea, but Ukraine gets the rest of its sovereign territory back. If I'm Ukraine, I would probably live with that. And also then, then the other question is, the other bargaining chip the West has is whether Ukraine becomes a member of NATO. But there are a lot of wild cards. The problem is that we, in some ways, you're seeing some momentum among pundits saying, now is the time to negotiate, now is the time to negotiate. Time to negotiate will be when the Russians feel like they're on their back foot, and they don't feel like that quite yet.
Well, so speaking of time to negotiate, we've seen a number of Western experts and policymakers say that now the time might be ripe for peace talks to bring about a ceasefire, perhaps something akin to the Korean Armistice Agreement of 1953. We even heard the Chief of Staff of NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg at one point say that a solution to the conflict could be for Ukraine to give up territory in exchange for NATO membership. And then I think he later apologized for making that statement, being pressured by Ukraine. So how do you predict the war might end? And what does Western leverage over Ukraine mean for potential negotiations with Russia?
So to answer the second question first, one of the things it means is that I suspect there will come a point at which Zelensky and the Ukrainians want to keep fighting, and the West will basically say, look, we will aid you up to this point, but no longer. And the fact is that Russia, is that Ukraine needs the West if it wants to be able to prosecute the fight, particularly on the offensive. They can fight a defensive war, or a guerrilla campaign without the West, but the conflict they're fighting now would be harder. The question is when the West is going to make that request. And I think so far they're not going to. And I think that, just in the short term, we want to see how this counteroffensive plays out. And the nature of the military tactics being deployed are such that I think it can be one of those things where it might seem like it's just a continued stalemate, and then suddenly you might get a breakout that no one anticipated. And so I think the interesting question is going to be, after this counteroffensive plays out, is there going to be any attitude in Ukraine for either a ceasefire, for a sort of longer term solution? And in part, that's a function of how successful the counteroffensive is. In terms of the grander negotiations, I do think one of the interesting things is going to be, to what extent will Ukraine be willing to trade territorial concessions to Russia in return for actual NATO membership? And is that a political deal that not just Ukraine will go along with, but frankly, the West will? Because for that to happen, Ukraine would actually have to renounce the territory. Because otherwise you're admitting a country that has a disputed, territory into NATO, and that creates all kinds of Article 5, complications. But even if that I guess the way I would put it is that if you step back for a second, if I told you 2 years ago that the Russian military was going to be exhausted, it would have managed to have, maybe control some of the oblasts in the east that had already had some influence in 2014. But you were going to have an incredibly, well-fortified Ukraine solidly within NATO, along with Sweden and Finland. I hate to say this, but from the US perspective, from the NATO's perspective, you would take that deal every time. And that might be one of the issues in terms of whether or not, what NATO's preferences are or what US preferences are, as opposed to what Ukraine's preferences are.
Do you think that US goals in the war have evolved significantly in the past year and a half? I think initially, when the war began, it was just about getting Russia to leave Ukraine. Then we heard such statements as those by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, where he said that the goal is we want to see Russia weaken to the degree that it can't do such things as invading Ukraine. Then I think the Biden administration walked that back to some extent, but I think there is an assumption now that the United States is really in it for the long haul. We saw Secretary of State Antony Blinken going to Kiev unannounced just recently and pledging that the Biden administration is working to support Ukraine long term. You famously said that we're at the end of grand strategy. And that
Yeah, that was famous. Sure, go ahead.
that there is a kind of changing nature of power and the diffusion of power in the international system, which makes it more challenging for the United States to shape its destiny. Do you think the United States is shaping its destiny now in Ukraine?
I do, but here's the thing about that end of grand strategy argument, which is that the real wild card in terms of US grand strategy. So let me put it this way. I would say two things on this. First, if I was articulating the Biden administration's position on this, I would make the case that US grand strategy on Ukraine has been a smashing success for the reasons that I said before. Also, the biggest reason is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has fundamentally altered how Europe thinks about the world. All right, our closest allies in the European Union, as well as the United Kingdom, previously had looked at Russia as, a source of cheap energy and China as a source of cheap goods. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has caused them to completely rethink that, to the point where, Putin had been holding the energy weapon, as a sort of coercive tool over Western Europe, and that no longer exists. And that's a significant strategic gain for the United States. A Europe that is wary of Russia and potentially wary of China is a Europe that is far more aligned with US interests than would have been the case even 2 or 3 years ago. Now, here's the catch to all this. US grand strategy will persist like this, except if a certain former president wins in 2024. All right, there's a presidential election coming in 2024.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, so the reason I argued about the grand strategy problem is that for grand strategy to be sustainable, it has to be durable. All right, and if you take a look at sort of US grand strategy documents during the Cold War and during most of the post-Cold War period, in some ways it's like a relay race in which a baton is handed from one runner to the next. There are minor deviations in terms of what administrations will prioritize, but not that much. And that changed in 2017. 2017, the Trump administration's grand strategy was very different, and not just very different, it was also a repudiation of the prior grand strategy. And this is an area where Trump has sounded very similar in terms of how he would govern come 2025. I mean, Trump says he can end the war in 24 hours. I mean, that's pretty impressive if he can do that. And based on his track record, I'm sure he will accomplish that without any problems whatsoever. So the wild card in all this is, to what extent, what is the likelihood that Donald Trump wins election again in 2024? And I wrote a piece that came out in Foreign Affairs last week about this, which is to say that, it's not just our partly what's going on is that Russia, if nothing else, has an incentive to hold out until 2025, because they know that if Trump wins, they are going to get a much better deal at the table than anything the Biden administration will offer. But furthermore, our allies are now sort of having to realize, okay, we've been working well with the Biden administration, but what is going to happen if Trump gets elected? And this, I think, is one of the reasons why you're seeing movements from Eastern European countries, from France, to maybe try to admit Ukraine into NATO sooner rather than later. Because if you get Ukraine into NATO, Trump in theory could pull out of NATO, but the important thing is that it makes it that much harder for him to do. So I will say that, I'm actually relatively optimistic on this point. I don't think Trump's going to win in 2024 for a variety of reasons. I know everyone freaks out about this, and I think we're all, I think a lot of people are very gun shy because of what happened in 2016. I don't think he wins in 2024. If he doesn't win in 2024, then in some ways that would allow for the possibility of not just this grand strategy to continue, but it would represent, in theory, a repudiation of the sort of Trumpist approach to foreign policy. And therefore, send a signal, not just to allies, but to rivals that, you're not gonna be able to count on the United States to shoot itself in the foot at the ballot box.
And I'm sure the Ukrainians are very cognizant of this issue and are paying close attention to what's happening in US domestic politics. So we'd like to open it up for questions now from all of you. You're welcome to raise your hand and I'll just call on you, please.
Thank you, Professor, for doing this. I'm Nayan. I'm in the MGA program first year. Okay, so my question is a bit different. We haven't really talked about that, which is the role of the global South. One of the major policy goals when the war began was to isolate Russia diplomatically and economically, which some would say has happened, but partially. What do you think the role of the global South in it and organizations like the BRICS, and now it is expanding? How serious you think this is in terms of achieving those policy goals and being a hindrance in those policy goals, and what the US and the West could do about it?
So obviously a lot of the global South has basically been playing a sort of hedging role in terms of dealing with all this, which is to say, if you take a look at the voting patterns or the rhetoric, I don't think they're terribly enthusiastic about what Russia is doing in Ukraine, but they're not radically opposed either. And I think there's a variety of reasons for this. One is just the historical legacy of the Soviet Union in terms of anti-colonial movements in the global South. Part of it is also that in some cases, there remain residual, trading ties or security ties, and this certainly explains India. There's a degree to which the U.S. can obviously try to engage in diplomatic campaigns, and I think you are seeing that. Whether it's Biden going to the G20 when Xi and Putin aren't there, or the actually significant number of high-ranking U.S. policy principals going to sub-Saharan Africa as a way of trying to indicate we are legitimately interested in this region now. And this also reflects other sort of global economic trends where suddenly everyone's paying attention to critical minerals, and that that makes certain countries that previously were not thought of as terrifically important, relatively important. Is it going to move these countries to suddenly join the Western Bloc solidly? No, I don't think so. Although I do think if Ukraine wins this war, or if Ukraine comes out stronger than before, that might be a pretty potent signal to these countries that actually, maybe betting on Russia is not the best move. And as for the expansion of the BRICS, I got to be blunt, I'm not impressed by this at all. I'm really not. It's great that, congratulations to the BRICS for expanding. So they're a larger grouping. I'm sure they're totally going to have a coordinated message with all of those countries, and particularly I would add India and China. The fact is that the BRICS grouping, you could talk about a Sino-Russian axis, as it were. That's a significant thing. The BRICS, nah, I'm sorry. I know that Brazil and India and South Africa are going to try to play at this being an important grouping. But the truth is that India's strategic interests are pushing it more closely into the West. And the other countries are not as significant in a strategic sense. And so, the global South will continue. One other thing I will say about this is that when you talk about patterns in the global South, one interesting thing is that it's less about Russia and the United States, more about China and the United States. There's a lot of talk about economic decoupling, about the idea that the U.S. and Chinese economy are desperately trying to segment each other, and want to force third parties to pick and choose. That last thing is not going to happen, because the truth is that most of the global South has more autonomy than you would expect. And so one of the things you're going to see, actually, I think, is less so much pure economic decoupling and more the rise of third parties that are essentially go-betweens between China and the United States. And frankly, you're also seeing that between Russia and the United States. When we were in Central Asia, it's shocking to report that when the US and the West imposed sanctions on Russia, suddenly US exports to places like Kazakhstan, Armenia, Uzbekistan went up. And shockingly, Russian imports from these places also went up. So one of the things you're seeing is that whether it's the case of economic sanctions with respect to Russia or export controls and decoupling with respect to China, these things are going to have an effect. I'm not trying to say they're not, but you're also going to see, third parties trying to exploit arbitrage opportunities.
Looks like Volodymyr has a question. I think you're muted.
Yes, that's right. I am not anymore, I hope. So once again, really not happy about not being with you right now, but really happy to be there online and see another manifestation of a really high level or of analysis that Russia Eurasia Program is able to provide for our consumption and enjoyment, and I'm hoping to be part of this work in the coming months. Dan, I agree with you on all the points that you made. This is not rare. Most of the time I am. On the Ukrainian side, I must say that still there is no space here, I think, for some kind of peace track or diplomacy track. I think Ukrainians are still willing to fight more and see how much land we can liberate. There's been some friction with the US, specifically with the US in recent weeks, because Ukraine been accused of not fighting the right way or something like that. Then it was smoothed over, specifically with Secretary Blinken being sent in person to Kiev, was one of the main reasons of his visit, to basically show that there is no major friction or disagreement between Kiev and Washington. But my question is about US. You mentioned about the divisions within US political establishment, specifically within one party, the Republican Party. I'm seeing now the news that apparently Speaker McCarthy is going to support the idea of impeachment hearings, President Biden in the House. Unfortunately, Ukraine policy is being politicized way too much, and that's not new. We can go back to 2019 when Trump was impeached by lower, chamber of U.S. Congress. What is your expectation then in terms of going forward? Do you see in the coming weeks and months, especially if there will be impeachment hearings, that Ukraine policy would continue to be hostage to this politicization, and maybe the balance, the delicate equilibrium within the Republican Party, where you have a number of members who still support Ukraine, would be unraveling?
Okay, I guess let's just put it this way. When it comes to GOP management of the House, I'm never optimistic. So, I mean, the fact that, as you say, McCarthy announced that today, or is going to announce tomorrow, that he supports an impeachment inquiry. First important question is, does he actually have the votes for this? While the overwhelming majority of the GOP caucus wants this, there are a fair number of Republicans that are, not at all enthusiastic about this, for no small part because there doesn't appear to be any evidence that justifies impeaching Biden. There was this absurd exchange, I think, on CNN last night where Nancy Mace was asked by Caitlin Collins, do you support an impeachment inquiry? And she says, yes. And Collins says, well, what evidence do you have to necessitate launching an inquiry? And Mace says, that's what the inquiry is for. But that's normally the way it's worked is that you need kind of a fair amount of evidence before you actually go to the impeachment inquiry. When it comes to Ukrainian aid, the issue here, I think the fundamental issue here is, to what extent is McCarthy willing to do something with Democratic support as opposed to, House Freedom Caucus support? If he relies on the House Freedom Caucus, Ukraine aid is going to be held hostage. And by the way, we're going to see Donald Trump getting more and more vocal about this over the next, week or month on this, because this is a position, that he's held. Now, it's not how the Democrats feel about it, and it's also, by the way, not how Senate Republicans feel about it by and large. So in some ways, it's an interesting question of, to what extent can McCarthy get what he wants, not just on the impeachment inquiry, but also on government spending bills? That's actually the top priority. And here, I honestly don't know how much McCarthy, I don't know what McCarthy is thinking on this. And it's hard for me to get into his head. It is possible that House Republicans legitimately believe that shutting down the government, launching an impeachment inquiry against Biden, and shutting off aid to Ukraine will all be popular enough to improve their chances for 2024. Now, to be honest, if you take a look at all three of those things, I would actually argue that the aid to Ukraine is probably the one on which the Republicans are on the strongest footing, unfortunately. And so that might be the thing that they wind up refusing to give up on, or refusing to give up. And that, unfortunately, if I was McCarthy has made it very clear over the last year that he will use Ukraine for political tactics more than anything else. It's not a coincidence that, last fall, he started waffling on Ukraine aid, even though he'd been full-throated in its support in the spring of 2022. And then miraculously, when Tucker Carlson goes off the air, when he's booted off Fox News, suddenly McCarthy sounds more supportive of aiding Ukraine. So when it comes to Ukraine aid, Kevin McCarthy is a political weather vane. He will blow with whichever direction the caucus goes. And so unfortunately, I'm not optimistic about the future of that aid. The one way in which it might be is if in launching this impeachment inquiry or if attempting to shut the government down, public opinion starts turning so much against the House GOP caucus, then McCarthy decides he has to appear reasonable.
Further questions? Yes, in the back.
Hi, my name is Julian. I'm an exchange student from Paris, and I'm interested in the question of mediation. Like, there have been a lot of countries who have tried to position themselves as mediators, for example, Turkey, Israel, the Vatican, China, India, and I'm interested of which you think has the likeliest of the best chances to appear in the role in the future.
The answer is none of them. None of them. Look, for there to be mediation, the Russians and the Ukrainians have to be interested in sitting down and actually having a negotiation. All right. But as we just heard, I don't think the Ukrainians are terribly interested in that right now. To be fair, they're pushing for a counteroffensive. And Arik will back me up on this. The Russians aren't interested either at this point. We've had conversations with a variety of, influential Russians on this. The Russians are, if anything, more implacable now than they were in February of 2022. And so the problem is that if neither side, I've said this ad nauseum since, I guess May of 2022. The problem is that both sides continue to have a plausible theory of victory. And until one side recognizes that they're not going to win, there is no negotiation to be had. And any, third parties can offer to do this until they're blue in the face. It's not going to lead to anything.
But I should qualify that by saying that there have been negotiations over smaller issues, not over the conflict as a whole. But Turkey has played a pivotal role in negotiations on the Black Sea grain initiative, on prisoner exchanges, and so on and so forth.
But you were talking about ending the war, period. That's a different kettle of fish entirely.
Over there.
Hello, I'm Shruti. I'm first year Ball. I wanted to know, what does Russian-backed coup in Niger or the African region, their seemingly increasing influence in the African region, mean for the Russia-Ukraine war?
I don't think it means much, to tell you the truth. You're asking I want to make sure I understand your question. You're asking Russia's influence in Niger and other sort of states where the Wagner group, how does that affect the war in Ukraine? I don't think it does. You're talking about, I want to say it's like 10,000 Wagner troops that are, deployed across sub-Saharan Africa. It's not like that's a huge drain on. In the
sense, because Niger is also a reserve for uranium. That's why.
I understand that, but I'm not sure how that affects the war per se. It's not. It's simply another component of what Russia's trying to do. Also, Russia's going to probably spend the next couple of months having to deal with the fact that since Prigozhin is dead, they clearly sort of want to nationalize and or take control over his empire, across sub-Saharan Africa. So it might be the case that Russia's policies in Africa wind up being a little more coordinated, but I don't necessarily think that has as much to do with Ukraine.
Yeah, there are some indications that the Wagner Group is kind of being absorbed by the Ministry of Defense, and certainly the leadership is going to change. This is something that one of our visiting scholars, Pavel Luzin, may have more insights into. I think the activities in Africa are going to continue, but there are questions about how that's going to be led going forward. Pavel, do you have anything to add on this?
First of all, don't overestimate all these natural sources rumors. Uranium, diamonds, gold, and so on. Just look at the statistics. How many, diamonds and uranium is extracted in Central African Republic, in Mali, in Libya, and you will see that the amount is insignificant. The main purpose why the mercenaries of Russia are deployed there in Africa is a troublemaking, because when you deploy mercenaries, when you make a deal with dictators, you create problems for France, for the United States, and so on, and so on, so on. The main purpose is problems for problems, not for, I don't know, economic gain, diamonds or something like that.
But this is all, the other thing I would add here is that, I mean, like this way, it does cause problems for France, there's no denying that. But, you know, and I guess the way I would put it is that this is a case where the U.S. can walk and chew gum at the same time. They can pay attention to sub-Saharan Africa. It's not going to necessarily cause them to lose focus in terms of Ukraine.
Other questions? Go ahead.
What do you think about the popular support for war in Russia, or the perception of it, despite a partial conscription and also mounting casualties?
I mean, I would say two things on this. The first is that, look, if you want me to, I can tell you the Russian narrative that would justify why they're moving on Ukraine. You know, Russia, you know, the Soviet Union used to be you know, the one of the two superpowers in the world. You know, then with the collapse of communism, Russia tries everything to join the community of nations, to be seen as part of the West. And how does the United States return the favor? It expands NATO right up to Russia's borders. It moves on Kosovo without any permission from Russia. It, you know, continues to deploy force elsewhere without UN Security Council mandate. So I don't lecture Russia about why they're suddenly, interested in expanding their territory. They need to have, you know, greater power because they are dealing with a more hostile West on this. Now, I could punch a number of holes in that narrative, but that's it, you know, it's a narrative that at least has some grounding in the truth in some ways. And so it's not surprising that Russia's supported. The second part of this is that, you know, do all Russians believe this narrative? No, of course not. But, you know, there's probably three groups of people we're talking about. There are first the true believers who really do buy the narrative that I'm selling. The second group are the ones who recognize that there's no upside to opposing Putin on this. You know, you're perfectly willing to sort of nominally declare whatever you want to declare, you know, just so you can be able to live your life. And the third group is leaving Russia. And since the third group is leaving Russia, you're not really, you know, they're no longer a political threat. So that makes things considerably easier.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Lindy. I'm from Shermold. I was just wondering how you see Russia's foreign policy changing in the next couple of years. Obviously, we don't know how much power they'll have militarily after this war. But do you think they'll be trying to reassert themselves in your countries, or do you think that they'll kind of be like retracted to the Russian thing closer to home?
Well, first of all, they're trying to reassert themselves now. I mean, you know, it's not like they're not waiting till the end of the war. As, you know, it's pointed out, they're active all across, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, they're active in Syria and so on and so forth. I think the big question, assuming the war ends, as you know, to use the context of your question, I think the really fascinating thing to think about is to what extent will China have leverage over Russia? Because if there is nothing else about, you know, this war, one of the interesting things is the degree to which Russians now seem comfortable with the idea of being China's junior partner across a variety of issue areas. And if the war ends, one of the interesting things I want to see is to what extent does Russia actually follow through on that? Because China doesn't actually have a vested interest in turmoil in Eastern Europe. They don't want to see, you know, they don't generally see much upside in terms of using military force to disrupt, you know, the territorial order outside of Taiwan. And so one of the interesting questions I think that's worth thinking about is to what extent will China actually constrain Russia rather than enable Russia? And that's an interesting point of view. The other aspect of this is the extent to which Russia might talk about being willing to be a junior partner for China now. After the war, we'll see whether they'll actually follow through on that. And it really does become a question of how quickly Russia can reconstitute its military forces after the war in Ukraine, and to what extent they can learn the lessons of what's going on in Ukraine. Now, to be fair, I would say, if anything, they're actually moving in the opposite direction, you know, in terms of eliminating Prigozhin and eliminating his allies in the Russian Ministry of Defense. What they seem to be doing is bolstering the very people who had the dumbass idea to invade Ukraine in the first place. And so this suggests that, in fact, Russia is going to be relatively slow to learn. But again, this is more, you know, I will defer to Pavel and other experts on this point.
Anybody else? Yes.
Hi, I'm Ian. I'm an MIB. Do you see any future regional allied blocs outside of NATO happening? Like Poland and Ukraine maybe, who probably take this war more intense than any other country does, and maybe their own maybe hatred of the Russians at this point. Do you see them creating some bloc in the future?
I mean, that's a fundamentally a question whether Ukraine winds up staying it joins NATO or not. If Ukraine joins NATO, then there's no need for an extra regional grouping.
How fast do you see a NATO, like what's the fastest Ukraine could join NATO realistically, or what do you think about it?
Day after the war ends. You know, I mean, I'm not saying that'll happen, but there's a scenario where the war ends in no small part because Ukraine gets one of the things it gets out of it is admission to NATO. But that said, there's a variety of other ways in which that can happen. If Ukraine doesn't enter NATO, then yeah, I could see, you know, some sort of Visegrad arrangement that could be created. Indeed, you saw Ukraine actually trying to develop, you know, foster that in the months prior to February of 2022. But I think what Ukraine wants in the end is NATO membership, because they recognize that, you know, it's the Article 5 guarantee that is the game changer. You know, we were in a meeting with some Russians, and one of the you know, they were talking about reconstituting the Soviet Union, the Soviet space. We asked them, did that include the Baltics? And they were very blunt in saying, we wanted to include the Baltics, but it's not going to because they're in NATO.
I guess, final question.
You said it's not in China's interest to see a war in Europe right now. So why do you think China is not playing a more active role in terms of, one, does it have that leverage? Some believe they do. To force Russia or to coerce them to end the war or to come to an agreement of sorts. Why do you think they are not playing that role? And do you see them playing a role in the short and medium term?
I mean, a few things on this. The first is that, you know, China is ambivalent about what Russia's doing in Ukraine. Obviously, China had a pretty strong trading relationship with Ukraine prior to the war, but at the same time, China's first, second, and third strategic interest is absorbing Taiwan. And so the idea of a great power, you know, having a territorial question in which they decide to use force to claim it, I can see why the Chinese are sympathetic to that. And the other strategic reason is that if China had actually, you know, reacted by, you know, China was put in the awkward position of, you know, creating this friendship without limits with Putin less than a month before Russia goes into Ukraine. It would have been impossible for them to back out of that. And also, by the way, if they had done that, you know, they're alienating their most important strategic ally. So I understand why, you know, China's between a rock and a hard place on this. I've seen some suggestions that China benefits from all this. I frankly find that insane. The last thing they want is a situation in which Russia continues to get weaker and the West learns all about how well its weapons can work in ground conflict. So, you know, China's stuck in a situation where they need to at least, you know, offer Russia rhetorical support, but at the same time, you know, they don't want it to escalate. And this is the one area where the Chinese have been relatively emphatic on this point is the nuclear question. And this is actually another reason why I'm reasonably confident there's not going to be vertical escalation.
Excellent. Well, that's all the time Professor Drezner has. He has another event to go to, but for those of you who just arrived, please stay. We're going to have lunch very soon. We'll have a chance to talk less formally, and we will also have a brief presentation from the Eurasia Club to talk about the club and some events that are coming up, and we'll introduce all of our student staff, or at least those of them who are here. But please join me in a round of applause for Professor Drezner.
Close by saying Sarah's awesome.
And speaking of Sarah, go ahead.
All right. Do I have to come up front?
You're welcome to come up front.
Okay. Hi. All right. Cool. A lonely chair. All right. Hi. So I'm Sarah Bond, second year MALD, focusing on security, conflict res, and Eurasia. So I'm the leader of the Eurasia Club. And typically kind of, we get a lot of questions about what's the difference between the program and what's the difference between the club. So kind of in a basic kind of explanation of this, the program is an official center on campus, while the club is student-led, and we do a lot of specific, more student-related events. Particularly, we do the lunch seminars, which will be at not exactly this time, but noon to 1:30 every Tuesday, just about every Tuesday for the rest of the semester. And we invite a lot of experts and really interesting people who give a lot of really cool talks, like a variety of different topics on the region. We had everything from economy, security. I think we had a vineyard in Ukraine as well, and sort of all over the map of kind of interests. And we also would love to hear feedback from what you guys want. And if you want to get involved with that, we also do a lot of different sort of fun events. I believe there was a movie screening last year. We had a concert where we invited Noise MC, does some really cool opposition work with music and a lot of anti-Russian, well, not anti-Russian, anti-Russian regime is a better way to put that. So we do a lot of different cool things. And if you want to get involved, please let me know and we can kind of talk about that. We also have a WhatsApp group you can join. So please ask me for that QR code. And I think that's about it. But if anyone has any questions or if I've forgotten anything, Arik, please let me know.
Sure. I should also say that we have our visiting scholars engaging with the Eurasia Club consistently. They give some of the lunch seminars. We invite scholars and practitioners from across the Boston area. And the Eurasia Club is also a great way to find out more about what the program is doing. So I encourage you all to sign up for the WhatsApp group and other forms of communication that you may have. But let's quickly introduce the other students who are working with the program so that you know who they are. Can you all stand up, those of you who are student staff, new student staff as well? Okay, and do we have Alexander Thomas on Zoom with us?
Alexander, are you in the room with us?
I think he was earlier.
Alex, yeah.
There he is.
Alex, hey.
Hey, everybody. Good to see you all.
See you.
So Alex just recently graduated, but he was a co-leader of the Eurasia Club with Sarah during the last academic year. He was also our staff writer and editor with the program. We have a number of writing and editing positions for students. And he was also a research assistant, helped to organize that study trip to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan that you all heard so much about from Professor Drezner. And we also have Eurasia. Do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Assistant for the program and the club, and yeah, a lot of posters you see would be done by me. I think there's a lot of graphic design and other stuff that I helped the program with too, and I was also part of the Turkey study trip. But yeah, that's
Excellent. Thanks, Nirja.
Hello everyone, my name is Daniel. I'm from Tashkent, Uzbekistan. The fourth picture on the poster, that's Uzbekistan. So let you know, I'm interested in nuclear.
I think that's Samarkand, actually.
Yeah, that's Samarkand. So, but just
sure.
I'm interested in nuclear weapons, international law, and arms control, and I'm working as a research assistant with Mr. Arik Burakovsky, and that's pretty much it.
Welcome. Sitara.
Hi, I'm Sitara. I'm the new social media manager for the program. Please follow us on social media. One follow equal to one me happy.
Excellent. Yes, we're on Twitter and Facebook. I think we're expanding very soon to Instagram and LinkedIn. Definitely follow us on social media. It's a good way to find out about the content that is being produced by our visiting scholars, by faculty, by me, but also by our students and alumni. And you'll also find out about events and all sorts of other activities that we're doing. Nayan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nayan Said. I'm from India. In the program, I'm the senior staff writer and editor. Right now, I'm just 1 week into the program, and I'm enjoying it. And yeah, I'm in the MGA program and focusing on the triangle of India, US, and China. Yeah.
Excellent. And we have several other student staff. It looks like not everybody is here. Pratyusha should be here. Pratyusha, do you want to quickly introduce yourself? Great timing.
My name is Pratyusha. I graduated in May, but I'm still working with the program, and I'm the events manager. I've been working for the past year, and yeah, happy to see you guys here and hope to see you all in the future events.
Thanks, Pratusha. And yeah, so she manages all of our events, the logistics, promotion, and this event included. So thank you, Pratusha, for all the work that you do. Let's see, Hannah?
I don't think she's here.
So she's another one of our staff writers and editors. Then we have Vishal Manbe, who is our outgoing social media manager. Am I missing anybody? Oh, Padmini. Padmini is our website manager. And then we also have Alex Nejade, who is a recent graduate and is staying on in a program management capacity, but he has also managed our website before and did a number of other things. So we hire generally about a dozen Fletcher students every academic year, and they do a variety of roles, including communications assistants, research assistants, events planning, and administrative tasks. And also we have some who are teaching assistants with our faculty. So I know it's 12:05. I think lunch is just about ready, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have about the program. We can do it now or outside during lunch. Does anyone have questions now? We can sit down and answer any. Yes.
I know everyone, I'll just ask my question. Sorry to like hold things up, but I am curious what opportunities might exist for students to get involved in research who are not hired research assistants. Are there opportunities? And just generally, what does involvement in the center look like for students who just are not employees?
That's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. So we do have funding for students to pursue research on their capstone projects or their doctoral dissertations, or even for academic papers if they're related to Russia. And we can give you that funding to design your own research travel or travel for a conference or for research expenses that you might have. We also have funding for students to pursue internships in the region. And another way that students can get involved in the research of the program is by applying to take part in our study trip. So we have already determined where we will go in March of 2024 during spring break. We will announce that very soon, so stay tuned for that. But usually we assemble a group of about 10 to 15 students, and then they work on a policy paper throughout the semester with the goal of getting it published in an external publication. So that's a great way to get involved in the program's research.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Art. How are you? How were your summer travels? I hope they were well.
It's great to see you.
Good to see you too. Logistically, will we be meeting around here in 114?
Yes, so we will skip next week, I think, because there are some other activities happening, including I think the Lear Institute is putting on an event. But the following week, we will start our weekly Fletcher Eurasia Club lunch seminars, and they will not be here. They will be at 114 Curtis Street, Somerville, which is just across the street from the Fletcher Field. That is the home of the Fletcher Russia and Eurasia Program. That's where we have our offices. That's where my office is, and the visiting scholars are there too. And we have a conference room there for about 25 people. So that's where we do the lunch seminars. We do have some other events coming up, so thank you for asking that question. Next Tuesday, I think September 19th, we will have an evening event from 5:30 to 7 p.m. with one of the most prominent historians of Ukraine, Serhiy Plokhy from Harvard. He will speak about his new book on the Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History. And if there's one book to read on the war between Russia and Ukraine, it is that book. I highly recommend it, and I look forward to seeing you all. I think that event is tentatively in ASEAN Auditorium, so that should be our first big event of the semester. Excellent. So look forward to seeing you all at the lunch and to seeing you at our future events. Thank you all.